Welcome to the lecture for research methods. I'll be talking about some more about how to design an experiment. Today, focusing on defining and measuring variables. So, first thing, let's talk about some fundamentals of measurement. We're talking about measuring things. What is it we're talking about measuring? Maybe things like frequency of yelling, uh, degree of feeling irritable, thoughts of hitting someone, even heart rate. So these are all different things we can measure. These are all actually different aspects, potentially, of one thing, right? Of maybe frustration tolerance. And frustration tolerance may be the thing we're interested in. We're measuring other things to get at this other thing, right? This is not very tangible. You can't really see frustration tolerance firsthand. You can see indicators of it. The thing we're interested in is really something we talk about being a construct, right? Usually in behavioral science, we're interested in constructs, in ideas, in intangible things. We can't measure them directly, but we measure indicators of those constructs. Um, so how do we measure these constructs? Well, there's a couple things to think about. One, they can be mailed on different scales of measure, and there are really actually multiple ways of dividing this up, but most people learn, and one of the simplest ways of dividing up would be the kind of four basic scales of measure, looking at nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scales of measure. So if something is measured on a nominal scale, that's when you use it to describe categorical variables. Variables where at different levels of the variable, they differ in quality, but not quantity. Frequently, an independent variable is something that is on a nominal scale. You're in the treatment group or the control group. The treatment group isn't, 2 times as much as the control group. It's different. It's qualitatively different. So it's on that variable is on a nominal scale. If we move on to the ordinal scale, this one we're looking at outcomes or observations that can be ordered along some continuum, first, second, third place in a race. So there's some order here, but first and second might have been neck and neck, only a second apart, and then third place could have been 2 minutes later. So we don't really have as good an idea, maybe as with some other scales of measure with ordinal. Ordinal, all we know is the order. We don't know how far apart things are in terms of whatever variable we're looking at. All we know is what order they're in. Hence the next scale, which most things are measured on, which would be interval. So there's still order, but now the variable has equal intervals. We know how much more or less of a quality one outcome has compared to another. But we don't have a true zero with an interval scale. And because of that, you shouldn't talk about comparing, when you're comparing something measured on an interval scale, two things, saying, oh, well, they responded with twice as much liking for option A as option B. Unless there is an option for no liking at all, which frequently we don't have that, then you can't say that. It's kind of a mathematically illogical thing. And that's why we have the ratio scale, where we have equal intervals and a true zero, where there can be an actual absence of the trait. You have that, then you can talk about twice as much, 3 times as much, half as much ratios of one level compared to another. But most things are measured on interval or ratio scale that we'll be interested in. Another way to kind of divide this up, other than kind of scales of measure, would be just looking at whether or not a variable is continuous or discrete. Continuous variable is one that can assume any value. So think about gender being a continuous variable in terms of level of femininity, right? And you can on some scale of 0 to 10, you could be a 0, a 10, a 5, a 5.1, a 5.2, 5.2, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. There's infinite number of values that that variable could have. Right? So you could fall anywhere on some sort of continuum, right? Versus a discrete, where a variable can only assume certain values. For example, sex, man, or women. Okay, so quick aside here. Note, I use sex as an example because it's easy to understand and it allows for a relevant comparison with gender. But although sex is typically thought of as a categorical variable and measured categorically, this may not really be the case. I say this because intersex individuals, which are a very diverse group, may not fall clearly into one category in terms of male or female. It's a bit of a cop-out to say, oh, well, male, female, and other, so just creating this other category. Really, the reality seems that biological sex actually exists on a continuum. It just happens to be that most people are at extreme ends of that continuum, and clearly male and clearly female, but there are other people that are somewhere in between. So even some things that you may think of as clearly discrete variables may not be. But in general, typically a variable by its nature is either continuous or discrete. But you can make a continuous variable discrete just by dividing it up arbitrarily, so level of aggression, that could be some continuous variable, but you can, however people score on your measure of aggression, you could divide it up into high and low aggression. Now you've made a continuous variable into a discrete variable. Sometimes that's easier for simplicity's sake, but you may lose some important variability if you do this, especially if you're trying to do kind of work with regression or correlation, where having variability to predict things is important. In terms of how this relates to the scale of measure, things that are measured on nominal and ordinal scales are typically discrete, and things measured on interval and interval and ratio scales are typically continuous. Okay. So how do we know if we're measuring some construct well? Well, there's actually an entire field dedicated to measuring how well we measure things, psychometry or psychometrics. So we can look at the psychometric properties of a measure or a measurement approach to determine how well it's measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. And the key psychometric features we'll talk about are reliability and validity. So let's spend a bit of time now talking about these psychometric properties and what they mean. Okay, so we'll start with talking about reliability. Basically, reliability is about consistency of measurement. Now, to what extent does an approach to measuring some construct yield the same outcome across time, across raters, or across measurement items? We talk about different types of reliability. We talk about temporal stability or test-retest reliability, and that's simply if some construct shouldn't change across time. So let's say your intelligence. If I measure intelligence, using this test now, and I come back 2 weeks later and measure intelligence again, and there's no reason to believe that you should have gotten smarter or dumber in that time, then I should get the exact same score. If I don't get the exact same score, then I've got some problem with my test-retest reliability. Right? So the test should perform the same way over time, if, again, it's assuming that the construct is stable as well. We can also talk about inter-rater reliability. Frequently, this is something that's used whenever we're looking at measurements that are made using observation. So let's say we're observing some kid on the playground looking for level of aggression being displayed. So I may have 2 or 3 people rating what number of times that the kid is being aggressive. And I set clear definitions. Okay, being aggressive for this kid is doing this, this, or this. Even if I give really good operational definitions of what aggression is, not everybody may agree that the kid is doing that thing. So I want to assess, okay, so if I have this procedure and this definition and I give it to people, how often will they come up with the same responses? Okay, yeah, we both agreed this was aggression, this was aggression, this was aggression. We had 100% inter-rater reliability. If so, I've got a pretty good approach for measuring aggression. If there's lots of differences across raters, then the definitions I come up with and whatever scale I gave them doesn't have very good inter-rater reliability. It doesn't lead to good reliability across raters. Another type of reliability that's important is internal consistency. And this is looking at, do items that measure the same construct correlate with each other. So typically we're talking about some paper and pencil test, typically, where maybe you have 10 questions, and they're all really about the same thing. They're all trying to assess how anxious the person is, but we're asking it 10 different ways. So internal consistency is, do people answer those questions the same way, consistently? So if all the questions, answering in the affirmative is consistent with being anxious, then people always answer them yes. If anybody answers yes very much to one, then they're going to answer yes very much to all of them. And if you answer no never to one of them, you answer no never to all of them. So they're all answered the same way consistently. Wherever somebody is on that construct, each question performs the same way. This is typically measured statistically with something called Cronbach's alpha, which, as you read in your reading, is not the most meaningful measure because it's influenced by inter-item correlations and number of items. So the more items you have, the higher your Cronbach's alpha, which isn't necessarily meaningful. So you may also want to look at the inter-item correlation. So look at how correlated each item is with each other, or the item total correlation, how much each item is correlated with the entire scale. And if those are decent, 0.15 to 0.5, then you probably have some good internal consistency. And that might be a better measure than just looking at, is your Cronbach's alpha above 0.8. Last, about reliability, talk about its relationship to validity. We'll think about, if our measure is unreliable, then we never know what we're going to get. So sometimes we'll get one answer. If we come back another time, we'll get a different answer. Or one person says, yeah, it's definitely this, and another person says, no, it's definitely this. Well, then what impact does that have on the conclusions we can draw from our study? It invalidates them. If you're not certain you're measuring what you intended, then you can't really say anything about your study. So reliability is required for validity. As we'll see in a minute, it's not sufficient for validity, but it's required. You can't have validity without reliability. Okay? Okay, so reliability is required for validity. So what then is validity? Well, think about measuring a variable, measuring a construct being like throwing darts. In measuring that construct, you're aiming at accurately measuring it. Right? And in darts, you're aiming at a bullseye. So if you repeatedly hit the same area of the dartboard with every throw, you've got good reliability. Now, if you repeatedly hit the bullseye, then you have good validity. So in terms of kind of further explaining what validity is, well, we talk about construct validity, which is the extent to which differences in scores or outcomes in some measurement, some test, reflect differences in the level of a construct. So construct validity is kind of the broad term for all other types of validity. All other types of validity we'll talk about are kind of pieces of construct validity. They influence the degree to which you have construct validity. So this is kind of the umbrella term for the degree to which, are you measuring what you say you're measuring, what you want to measure? So do differences in scores on this measure really reflect differences on the construct? So in terms of different aspects of construct validity, things that influence it, one would be content validity, which is the extent to which terms are relevant and representative of the construct for a particular assessment purpose. So if you wanted to ask about experience of depression, to have good content validity, one, you would have questions that are relevant to the construct of depression. So you wouldn't ask about, okay, what's your favorite movie? That's not relevant to depression. So it has to be relevant. It also has to be representative, and this is usually in terms of the breadth and depth of the questions. So if you just ask about mood symptoms, do you feel sad, do you feel depressed, do you feel low? Those are all fine and they're relevant, but they aren't fully representative of the construct of depression. Really, you need to ask about those kind of affective components. You need to ask about somatic things. You have problems sleeping. You need to ask about cognitive things. Do you have problems concentrating? Do you feel guilty? You ever think about suicide? So you need to ask about the full range of things that are representative of that construct to have good content validity. Then there's convergent validity. This is looking at the degree to which measures correlate with, or the degree to which a measure correlates with other measures of the same construct and with measures of other related constructs. So if you're trying to come up with a new measurement for depression, does it correlate with other people's measures of depression? Does it correlate with people's scores on the BDI? So if somebody takes your measure and they also take the BDI, does somebody look depressed on both, or do they look depressed on yours but not depressed on the BDI? If they look depressed on both or not depressed on both, as long as somebody looks the same on your measure and somebody else's measure, they correlate, then you have convergent validity. So measures of the same construct or also measures of related constructs. So we think about anxiety and depression are two correlated constructs. They frequently co-occur. People with higher depression often report higher anxiety. With higher anxiety, frequently report higher depression. So, does someone's score on your measure of depression, is it related to their score on some measure of anxiety? If so, again, you have convergent validity. So obviously there's a flip side of that, divergent validity, which you may also see referred to in some texts as discriminant validity. This is where you want your measure not to correlate with measures of unrelated constructs. So if your measure of depression correlates perfectly with a measure of aggression, that's a problem. I mean, there may be some correlation. Maybe some people, if they're depressed and there's an irritability that leads to this kind of low correlation with aggression, but they shouldn't correlate highly. If they do, then you're probably not really measuring depression. Right? So it shouldn't correlate with things that it shouldn't correlate with. And if that's the case, then you have the divergent validity. I kind of want to mention here too, because it sounds like discriminant validity. There's also discriminative validity, and this is the degree to which a measure can distinguish between groups that should differ on the construct being measured, which is slightly different. So let's say you have a measure of aggression. Discriminative validity, if your measure had good discriminative validity, then let's say you gave the measure to some college students and then a group of prisoners who have been convicted of violent crimes. If the college student population and the violent crime population score the same on your measure of aggression, then you don't have good discriminative validity. You want the violent crime population to score higher on your measure of aggression. If that happens, then you've got good discriminative validity. Your measure discriminates between these two groups who should be different on your construct. Okay. So convergent and divergent, and then discriminative, a little different than discriminant. There's also criterion validity, which within criterion validity we talk about both predictive and concurrent validity. And this is really about the degree to which scores on measures relate to some observable outcome. So convergent is, does your measure correlate with another measure, with some other construct? Criterion is similar, but instead of just relating to other measures of constructs, it's relating to some outcome, so really some behavior. So predictive validity, predictive criterion validity, somebody who scores high on your measure of aggression, if after that score is in the books, sometime in the future, everybody who scores high, turns out they go and get in a bunch of fights. People who score low don't get any fights. Well, you had good predictive criterion validity. And then concurrent is just it's the same thing, but it's just kind of now. So without asking people about their fights, I go ahead and give everybody a measure of aggression, and then I look at, okay, what I know about you now and of your past. Did people who score high on my measure, do they have a greater history of fights than people who scored low on my measure of aggression? And if so, I've got good concurrent criterion validity. So again, criterion validity about relating to some behavioral criterion or outcome. Then we have incremental validity. This is the degree to which a measure can improve the validity or accuracy of decisions made based on data. And this is really about kind of real-world use of a measurement. So not only can you measure this thing well, but if you're going to be using some measure to make a decision, does this use of the measure improve the decision making? So if we're looking at predicting recidivism in the prison system, right, trying to predict who's going to go reoffend and end up back in jail. And let's say, like right now, they're not using any measures, and they just kind of use maybe reports from the parole board and people's opinions, and they kind of raise their hands and vote, oh, I think they're going to reoffend, I don't think they're going to reoffend. And they're right, half the time, 60% of the time, whatever, they're right some amount of the time about who's going to reoffend. You need to figure out, okay, using your measure, does that increase the accuracy where, okay, you can now predict better than the way that it was being done? And frequently this will really depend how much room there is for incremental validity on the base rate of a phenomenon. Because let's say 90% of people reoffend. Well, it'd be hard to improve upon, to gain incremental validity upon saying, well, everybody will reoffend. If I say everybody will reoffend, I'll be right 90% of the time, and I'll only be wrong 10% of the time. So you have to do better than 90% accuracy with your measure than just saying everybody is going to reoffend. The last type of validity to talk about would be ecological validity. And this is should tie in nicely with what we talked about before about external validity. Ecological validity is the extent to which measurement is congruent with the real world. So if assessing marital satisfaction, let's say, and you're using some sort of pen and paper test to assess marital satisfaction, that has low ecological validity. Because when you're satisfied with your marriage, it's not usually shown by writing things down. Right? However, if you're doing home observation to measure level of marital satisfaction, you're watching a couple interact, that has a higher level of ecological validity. Right? The measure is more congruent with the real world expression of the construct you're interested in. So we've talked a bit about reliability and validity, the two kind of key psychometric properties, but one last thing I kind of want to note about psychometric properties, because if you pick a measure that's published, you can read about its psychometric properties. Oh, they're really good, oh, they're not so good. One thing that's important to keep in the back of your mind is psychometric properties are not always stable across groups. So, a particular measure, a test, may be reliable or valid for one particular group or for one particular purpose, but not another. So you want to know who's in the standardization sample. Whenever they did a study to figure out the psychometric properties, was it a clinical sample or a community sample? Was it people who presented with disorders, or was it just kind of everybody? What were the age of the participants? What was the ethnic representation like in those groups? And these are important questions to kind of keep in mind when thinking about whether or not a measurement has sound psychometric properties or not. Okay, I know I said that was the last thing I wanted to say about psychometric. One more thing I want to say, and this is actually a big thing in terms of validity. You should never say, just kind of blankly, that a measurement has good validity. That's would indicate a misunderstanding of what validity means, because it's validity for what purpose, right? So this measure has good reliability and validity when used to assess aggression in this population, or to make decisions about likelihood of reoffending, you need to provide a context for their validity. Like people say, oh well, the GRE is not a valid test. Well, it depends on what you're looking at and what decisions you want to make. Is the GRE valid for determining likelihood of success in graduate school? Well, yes and no. Somebody who scores, a 200 on the GRE, you can be pretty confident that they're not going to do as well in grad school as somebody that scores, 1800. But if we get anywhere in between there, we may not be as confident about what the scores mean. So you need to provide context when talking about if a test is valid or not. Valid for what purpose and with what group. Okay? Okay, so now let's talk about three kind of broad categories of measurement. Basically, there's self-report measures, physiological measures, and observational measures. And we'll talk about each. Looking at self-report measures, thinking about what things can people report about themselves. Well, generally, we ask them about their attitudes, their thoughts and feelings about something or about themselves. And they can also report their behaviors, how often they do something. Did they ever do something? In terms of advantages of self-report measures, it often provides a direct measure of some construct. For example, if the construct is self-concept, there's no more direct way of measuring that than asking someone, what do you think of yourself? Also, some thoughts or behaviors may not be easily observed by others or easily measured in any other way. Think about secretive behaviors like binge eating. It can be hard for anybody else to tell us the frequency that somebody's doing that, other than the individual, him or herself. And then, have you ever thought of hurting yourself? If they never told anyone, nobody else can give us that information except for that person. So there's some information they can't get any other way. Of course, there are some drawbacks and disadvantages to self-report measures. Sometimes the participant may be unwilling to tell the truth, right? If it's embarrassing information, even if this is kind of in a research setting, we'll kind of assure them that their responses will be kept confidential, maybe even made anonymously. There's still that fear that maybe somebody will figure out that I'm the one that said this, so they may not tell us something, tell us the truth, because they just don't want to. It might also be that they're unable to tell the truth because they don't really have full access to the truth. So in terms of asking people about how frequently do you lie? People probably don't monitor themselves that closely for how often they do things that are unfavorable or looked upon poorly. They may not give an accurate account of that information just because, not because they don't want to tell us, because they really don't know. So we can't assume that people have full self-knowledge. That would be a bit naive. So we kind of recognize that that's one disadvantage to self-report measures. In terms of how it's done, we'll look at some of the features. Frequently, self-report measures, and even measures from others, will use Likert type scales. Common way of kind of assessing information with a kind of classic Likert scale. You have a statement about a clearly defined attitude that's clearly positive or negative, and the person rates their level of agreement. Completely disagree, somewhat disagree, neutral, somewhat agree, completely agree. If you vary it off from the kind of classical Likert scale, it's no longer a Likert scale, it's a Likert type scale. But anytime you have a statement and then some options about your agreement with it, it's typically referred to as a Likert type scale. So the minimum legal drinking age should be increased. Completely disagree to completely agree, and they'll circle one or mark on a line somewhere. But you might also see something that's similar to a Likert type scale, but even a little more different, where we're asking people to talk about frequency of behavior. So, there might be a statement of some behavior like, I buy alcohol for minors, and then they rate it never, almost never, sometimes, frequently, always. Or you kind of choose the anchors. So we get people to report either on their attitudes or their behaviors, and usually with some continuum. Usually we don't ask people yes/no questions. There's debate about whether or not we get added information by having multiple choice type things versus yes/no. Also, for self-report measures, we can use symptom checklists. We kind of which of the following have you experienced in the past 2 weeks? And then with those, we also do kind of frequency, never, sometimes, always, or never, somewhat, very much so. And then with these symptom checklists, usually we have clinical cutoffs where some number of behaviors, combination of number of symptoms and or frequency of symptoms, severity of symptoms, that seems to distinguish between really having a problem and not having a problem. So with the idea that one or two symptoms or may not be a problem, that may be typical, but there's some cutoff that fairly reliably distinguishes between problematic and not problematic. Even beyond that, kind of these cutoffs, some measures use a normative reference group, their norm reference measures, right, where the measure has been given to some large group of people, so that the individual performance of any one person now can be compared to the norm group to see if you're above or below average, right? And then we can use kind of fancy standardized scores, T-scores, to say, okay, you're at 50 T, so you're exactly average, or you're at 70 T on this measure. You're 2 deviations above the mean. And if it's a measure of pathology, then now that's probably in the clinical range, and whatever we're measuring is probably a problem for you. Few people reported things quite the way you do. Right? And that's one thing that norm reference measures can give you for self-report. You might also see, or might decide to use physiological measures. Right? So in terms of what's measured with these things, well, really it's autonomic nervous system and central nervous system functioning. With autonomic system and things like heart rate, digestion, respiration rate, salivation, perspiration, pupil dilation. And the assumption here is that these are physical. Well, frequently the assumption here is that these are physical manifestations of psychological phenomena. Right. So we're interested in how angry or anxious or aroused someone is, and we're measuring these physiological things as an indicator of this psychological state. Or with the central nervous system, we can look at the actual structure and even the functioning of the brain with things like EEG, PET scans, MRIs, functional MRIs. Usually we do that either looking for structural differences between people with some feature, maybe a disorder, versus not having that feature, not having a disorder, see if there are structural differences, or maybe with functioning things where we have people engage in some task, read these words, think about an argument you had with somebody, and we see how your brain works. You can do those things. And the advantages to these measures, one, it's hard to lie or fake a response. So on self-report, you can answer in a socially desirable way, or you can make yourself seem worse than you really are, or better than you really are. With these physiological measures, it's harder to do that on purpose. Some people obviously can. You can gain some control over your autonomic nervous system, and you can slow your heart rate, speed your heart rate up with a lot of practice. But most people can't do that very well, and certainly with the CNS stuff, pretty hard to fake that. You certainly can't fake differences in brain structure. Another advantage, as one of my old mentors used to say, it's sexy. And sexy in terms of people like to read about this stuff. They like reading about research with PET scans, or, oh, they measured heart rate. Ooh, that sounds really good. People get excited reading that kind of stuff because it feels more like real science or hard science than things that maybe are harder to wrap your head around in terms of some measure of transference or countertransference. Right? So it's easier for people to kind of understand these things. At least they think it's easier to understand. In terms of disadvantages, however, um, there's frequently ambiguity with the results. You know, a lot of physical phenomena like sweating are related to multiple psychological constructs. So if somebody's sweating, and you're doing kind of galvanic skin response stuff, is that because they're anxious about lying? Some lie detector test stuff. Are they anxious just about the test situation? Or maybe they're angry in their sweating, or is it just they're generally an anxious person? So you can say yes, they're sweating, but you don't know exactly what that means. And then the other disadvantage to physiological measures would be expense, especially with the CNS stuff. Brain scans are incredibly expensive and usually not part of typical psychological study unless you're working in a hospital where you have access to those things and you have some pretty significant funding. Okay, so the third type of measures we talked about would be observational measures. And the first question that occurs to you is, well, who is observing these observational measures? Well, it's two kind of categories. One will be others, so others related to the target you're interested in. So the spouse, the parent, the child of the person you're interested in, having other people make observations about them, or the investigator herself or himself might make observations, in which case it would be direct observation. If you're worried about bias of others, you want to eliminate that, then you observe it directly yourself. In terms of what is observed, well, behavior and or attitudes. And in terms of direct observation, we always talk about observing behavior because that's the way we really think about what we can see is behavior. We can't see attitudes. Nonetheless, we typically, or we sometimes often ask others to report the attitudes of someone else. And so we're asking them to observe behavior, make some judgments about what that behavior means with regard to a person's attitude. Okay. So why might we do this? Well, there are some advantages to observational measures. One, we might get more accurate information in those instances where the target is unable or unwilling to give accurate information himself or herself. So if anybody has an interest in lying or misrepresenting themselves, or maybe for some reason doesn't have access to some self-knowledge, other people may see what they're doing. It might be a good way to get at that we couldn't get by asking them directly. In terms of disadvantages, well, the others might have that same problem in terms of being unable or unwilling to give accurate information. So there is a recognition that there is bias, potentially bias present in the reports of others when we're asking them to rate the behaviors or attitudes of another person. So what kind of things do we do to deal with this? Well, some of the features include using a coding system. And this is often used for direct observation. And the coding system is just a clear plan for what behaviors will be recorded under what circumstances. What behaviors will be recorded and under what circumstances a behavior meets certain criteria. We talked before about inter-array reliability, and you go with these kind of rules for, okay, when these things happen, yes, the behavior is present. If these things aren't happening, then no, the behavior is not present. Right? We look and see people agree on, yes, there's behavior present or not. Well, that plan is some coding system. And the better your coding system is, the higher reliability will be, and probably the better your validity will be. Another thing to think about when kind of gathering observational data is you want to think about how representative the sample of behavior you get is. And obviously, you want it to be as representative as possible. So when you're observing somebody or asking somebody else to observe someone, you want to think, okay, well, the things that I'm seeing, is this how it typically is, and is this representative of how this person behaves in other situations and other times? Right? The third thing I kind of want to note about observational measures is agreement across raters, including agreement between others and the self, so self-report and other report, is typically a good thing. Right? We have this kind of triangulation. Okay, you said you were depressed, your spouse said you're depressed, and your boss said you're depressed. You're probably depressed. Right? So agreement is typically a good thing in terms of giving us confidence about something. But disagreement isn't necessarily a bad thing either. And it doesn't necessarily mean that someone is wrong or lying. There's a recognition that people have different perspectives. And it may be important that you say you're depressed and your spouse says you're not depressed. And we don't say, oh, well, the spouse is wrong or the spouse is lying. Maybe that's an important part of you being depressed, that your spouse is unaware of how you're feeling. Right, so it's all potentially useful information. Okay, some kind of final issues in assessment. Multiple questions are typically better than a single question. If you want to know if someone is experiencing a major depressive episode, probably a more accurate, more valid approach to ask about all the symptoms of depression rather than just, are you depressed? Right? And there is some point of diminishing returns where you only get so much more validity from adding questions. But it can be hard to know where this point is without collecting data to find out this kind of empirical question. So for your dependent variable, don't ask just one question, obviously. On a similar note, multiple methods are frequently better than a single method. So self-report plus other report, or self-report plus observation. When we have different methods that agree, they both give kind of the same result, then we're much more confident in that result than if we got it from just one method, right? Because each method has its own bias, but if different methods both agree on the same endpoint, then our confidence goes up. In terms of sensitivity and specificity, when you're asking, well, does this measure identify a problem every time the problem is there? If so, then it's got good sensitivity, right? It's sensitive to the presence of the problem. And that's something you typically want. The other side of that is, does the measure only identify problems when they are there? And so no false positives. This would be specificity. Right? And to think about the relationship between sensitivity and specificity, they're a bit inversely related. You could maximize sensitivity by saying, everyone has a problem. Well, you're not going to miss anybody. Everybody has it. Right? But you're going to be sacrificing specificity. You're going to have a heck of a lot of false positives where you're saying people have a problem and they don't really. Another thing to keep in mind with assessment would be range effects in terms of ceiling and floor effects. So with the group you're looking at, we would be getting enough variability, or is there a possibility that everybody's going to be scoring at the top end of your measurement? This kind of ceiling effect where maybe you're using some sort of IQ test and you're working with these super geniuses, so everybody's at 130 IQ, but they're all 130 IQ, and you can't tell the difference between them because that's as high as your test goes, right? So there's a ceiling effect where you needed a higher ceiling on your test because their responses are up higher. Then there also be floor effect where everybody's down at the bottom and they all look the same. They're not the same. Your test just doesn't go any lower to account for some low level of a construct. Another thing to think about would be participant reactivity. To what extent is the person's behavior going to be distorted because it's being measured? So you're thinking about social desirability things. Is there some sort of right way to answer the questions you're asking that may influence people's responses? And then also having people think about the things you're going to be cueing them to think about, asking certain questions. Will that in and of itself affect their behavior and then end up affecting the behavior you're collecting? Last here, be aware of the potential for experimental bias. So think about with whatever measurement approach you're thinking about, how much room is there for you to influence the data. If you use, for example, for observation, if using some sort of standardized observation protocol, there's less room for experimental bias than unstandardized observation. If you say, I will observe Christians to determine whether or not they get angry, well, there's a lot of room for bias in there. That's probably not going to be a very valid measurement. Okay. Now, last thing we'll talk about, some specific pointers for your proposal that you're writing, your study. I encourage you to use existing measures rather than try to create your own for your dependent variable, because existing measures typically have known psychometric properties, and they're published, so you can know how reliable and valid these tests have been with particular groups for particular purposes. If you're curious where to find measures, the Mental Measurements Yearbook with tests in print is a database linked to the library. Same place as PsycInfo, instead of above PsycInfo alphabetically would be where this is. It's a good place to search for measures, and this will take you to reviews of different measures. You can kind of read about the strengths and weaknesses of particular measures and what things they are made to measure. You may not be able to get your hands on an actual copy of a measure, depending on what it is, but you can try. Once you look up Mental Measurements Yearbook, you can find who the author is, and if it's not something that's in public domain, you can email the author and say, I'm a student working on a research project. Could I please use it? Could I please see a copy of your measurement for research purposes? Because if things are copyright protected, they don't want people going out there and using them without paying them. For research purposes, often people are willing to give you a free copy. Another thing to think about, read the methods section of other articles. So if there's another article that uses some sort of method similar to yours, or is just looking at variables similar to what you're looking in, how did they measure the variables? How did they operationally define the variables? And if it makes sense to you and it made sense to them and they got it published, then it's probably a good way to do it. And then the last point I just want to make is make sure you spend time thinking about exactly what it is you want to measure before you start go looking for tools. Clarify in your own mind. So are you looking at are you want to look at marital satisfaction? Or are you want to look at marital conflict? Those are two different things, right? Are you wanting to look at level of intimacy? Right? These are all kind of related constructs, but they're different. Which part of the idea is most important to you, and then look for measurements on that. Okay, good luck.